Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you to all of the testifiers for your thoughtful remarks. I just want to respond a little bit to Senator Fisher's question because Dr. Eccles, with all due respect, I don't think that this is going to end up being effective if it's voluntary, because you can't have individual coders just sort of waking up in the morning and say, what are the ethical implications of this? Because they're engineers, they are supervised, they are told to deliver a product, they deliver that product. The only way to provide an effective counterweight to the fiduciary obligation to maximize clicks, which is essentially, as Senator Klobuchar said, the maximization of revenue, is to establish in federal law an affirmative obligation not to harm the consumers whose data is being collected. I'm all for notice and consent, but we all know that we click I agree as a matter of course without reading anything, and it's not fair to individual consumers to ask them to opt out of the world, essentially, in order to retain their privacy rights. So in my view, the only way to do this is to establish you may collect data from individuals, as you are, but you have an affirmative obligation to not use that data against people, which doesn't mean you can't do behavioral advertising. It just means you can't harm people. Most companies are comfortable with that. The ones that are not comfortable with that either have government relations and lawyers who are just nervous about what that would mean, or they are actually worried that they are in the business of harming people. So just wanted to offer that for Senator Fisher. I have not yet had a Republican co-sponsor of our legislation, but I'd invite you to take a look at it. For Ms. Gonzalez, Chair Khan is known as a sort of antitrust crusader, and I know that she's moving on FTC action against some of these dominant internet companies from a competition policy standpoint. But I'm wondering about the Section 5 authority to find unfair and deceptive practices, and even the FTC's authority under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Does the FTC have authorities that it's not yet using? In other words, have we already delegated some of this policymaking to the FTC, and should it exercise additional authorities?
Yes, Senator, I do think it already has some authority to act here and that it should exercise that. I think the work that Chair Khan is doing on the antitrust front is incredibly important. I also think an inquiry about how companies are violating our privacy and using our data to harm us is incredibly important and should move forward under the unfairness doctrine, which the FTC already has authority to move forward on. The other two statutes that you referred to around credit reporting, certainly I think the FTC should enforce that statute. Those statutes may not be broad enough to get at the harms that we're seeing online where our personal data is extracted, used to target us in harmful ways. And so that is why I believe the FTC ought to initiate a proceeding focused on privacy and civil rights as well.
Yeah, just in response to the last comment you made about it may not be, we may not have a broad enough statute. Point taken, but I'll also observe that, been on the Commerce Committee for now a number of years, and our complaints about tech and big tech are so broad and so numerous as to overwhelm our policymaking ability. Besides the filibuster and our normal partisan disagreements, we sort of can't separate out what are we just irritated by, what do we think is real harm, how do we balance the needs of American users of technology with the kind of fear that we could set a precedent for, say, Kyrgyzstan to impose authoritarianism through their own controls. So I think the important thing for us as a committee and as a Congress is to chip away at this, is to say, well, what Section 230 reforms make sense, right? And what antitrust actions make sense? And what protections for researchers make sense? Because I do think that, especially during the last administration, this sort of invocation was almost an incantation against big tech became so expansive as to become meaningless and very difficult for policymakers to sort out, and even more difficult for politicians to sort out. Because if you say, well, it's not so simple, you look like you're schlepping for these big tech companies when in fact this stuff's complicated. And we've seen sort of comprehensive legislation fail and fail and fail. And I subscribe to my predecessor, Danny Noy's point of view, which was his 40% rule, which is try to get 40% of whatever you're asking for, and by the third year, you've already got more than you've ever asked for. I always chop that in half and say I get 20% because I'm certainly not Danny Noy. Thank you.